The Lenovo ThinkSystem ST45 V3 might be Lenovo's lowest cost server, but it's actually awesome. Inside, we get an AMD EPYC processor, ECC memory, plenty of expansion for a low-cost server, and much more. And the best part is, it doesn't use too much power. And in true STH fashion, we took the base ST45 V3 and we made it way, way better. So I think we have a lot to get into today. Let's get to it. Hey guys, this is Patrick from STH, and this is the Lenovo ThinkSystem ST45 V3. And as you can see, unlike a lot of servers that we look at, this is a small tower server. But it's also one of Lenovo's newest servers, even though it's a V3, and so I thought, well, we should go take a look at it. Well, when I ordered this server, I really focused on getting the base level, right? What is the lowest cost one that I could really get, other than I made one upgrade for the power supply? Because my plan all along was to purchase the base model and then upgrade it in ways that maybe Lenovo didn't even think about. So before we get too far, of course, I have to say that we did purchase a server, but AMD did provide the processors, and we're gonna say they're sponsoring this video. We also have to say thank you to our STH YouTube members who have provided some of the funding so we could go buy some of the components that we ended up using in this. It takes a lot to get these videos out, so I just wanna say thank you up front. And we also have another little surprise. I wanted to also look at the ST50 V3, which is the Intel version. And the reason I wanted to do that was because for many generations, the lower end of the market, or the single socket entry-level server segment, has been just dominated by Intel Xeon E. And this is a major server vendor, Lenovo, putting out a EPYC 4004 series tower really to compete head-to-head in that entry-level segment. And by doing so, they're offering things that we just never had before. So with that, let's get over to the other side and look at the hardware. Okay, so for this system, there is a clear competitor because the Lenovo ThinkSystem ST45 V3 is the AMD version, and you're gonna see that we have a very similar ST50 V3, which is the Intel Xeon version that in some ways this one displaces, although they're a little bit different in their positioning. Now, from the overall chassis size and just the look and feel of them and how they're set up and all that kind of stuff, these things are very, very similar if you were gonna take a quick glance. In fact, most folks wouldn't even notice the difference between them until maybe you looked at things like your USB ports. You'll notice that we have like 2 USB ports or Type A ports on the ST50 V3, but we have 5 USB 3 ports, and some of them, like we have a Type C port and all that kind of stuff, on the ST45 V3. But on the back of these systems, it gets absolutely crazy. You'll see on the ST45 V3, we have 4 USB 2 ports, but on the ST50 V3, we have some of our USB 3 ports, but they're just on the rear. So overall, we actually have more USB ports on the AMD, but it's a little bit different mix between the two of them. And really, that's just the absolute start of the differences, because let's start with the I/O that you have. The ST45 V3 is really meant to be managed more locally, and we'll show you a way to do it remotely as well in a little bit. But when you have a system like this, you're gonna see that we have DisplayPort outputs. We also have HDMI. This thing can actually power multiple displays out of the rear, and also at like 4K resolution. If you have the ST50 V3, you're stuck using VGA. And just also as a fun little one, you also have audio out on the AMD. So if you need audio out, you have a line out or a headphone out or whatever you need on here, which is something that you don't get on the ST50 V3. And I know a lot of folks are gonna ask, why? Who cares about this? Frankly, a lot of folks will have some kind of HDMI monitor, whether that's a TV or something else, on site, especially if you're at a small medium business. That's very common, whether it's a PC monitor, whether it's a TV or something like that. So you will be able to go and easily go and use these DisplayPort or HDMI ports to go and get video out. VGA is very common still in the data center, but it's a lot less common outside of the data center these days just because it's so old. Now, one of the other big ones that you're gonna notice immediately is the fact that we only get 1 network port on the ST45 V3, but we get 3 network ports on the ST50 V3. That is for a very simple but important reason. We can have the xClarity or Lenovo xClarity controller, the full BMC setup on the ST50 V3, which I know a lot of folks want, but on the ST45 V3, we don't have that. That also means that we go from that dual port low-end Broadcom 1 gig NIC to a single 1 gig NIC on this. Again, this is one of those ones where I think folks are gonna say like, oh, I really want something higher end because I want more performance. But on the other hand, I think there are a lot of folks that are also gonna be like, yeah, it's an edge device, so who cares? But for both the out-of-band management as well as the just higher speed networking, we got a solution for you. We're gonna start customizing this system in a little bit. Now, let's get inside the systems to really see how they differ from, I guess, how they're laid out. Now, looking inside the systems and actually pulling off these are exactly the same process. I mean, these are the more or less the exact same chassis. So when you get to the internal layout, they're frankly very similar. Now, something you're going to notice is that in the ST50 V3, we have all of these brackets, and these are really there for hard drives. But what we're lacking is we don't have a SATA power cable. And because there are no M.2 slots, instead of M.2, we have PCIe slots, there's actually nowhere to directly plug in a SSD to the system. Now, what you'll see that we ended up doing was just putting a little Sabrent M.2 to PCIe converter that we reviewed on the STH main site. We'll link that down in the description, but you can see that we put it in there just to be able to get a SSD or any kind of drive working in the system. You otherwise need proprietary Lenovo cables for like the SATA connectors. There's also a official Lenovo M.2 adapter that we didn't have, but you do have that option. But on the AMD side, we didn't get any of that, which makes the system extremely easy to work on. But one thing that's nice that we were able to do is we were able to install an M.2 SSD by just screwing in a M.2 SSD, no problem, and we were ready to go. Now, that's only one of the possibilities that we could have done, because on the bottom edge, you're gonna see that there are M.2 and wireless LAN connectors. On this system, you can go and in theory, you could just plug a wireless LAN card in there and get Wi-Fi. And you could also plug in a second M.2 SSD right down there. Super easy. Now, in terms of the CPU, of course, we get our AMD EPYC 4004 series. And this one is the AMD EPYC 4124P, which is a 4-core, 8-thread processor. Now, on the Intel side, we have the Intel Xeon E, which is a 4-core, 4-thread processor. So we get 4 extra threads in this one, although it is 10 watts higher TDP, but we'll show you that it's not actually that clear cut on who wins in power consumption when we get to our power consumption section. Now, something else that gives you a little bit more performance is that the AMD supports up to DDR5 5200 ECC memory. So unlike desktop systems, you do get ECC memory support in here. Now on the ST50 V3, you also get DDR5. However, you're only getting DDR5 4800. So it's just that little bit lower of memory speed. Now, one of the things that I wish Lenovo did for the ST45 V3 is I wish that they just added those 2 extra DIMM slots. Give us a full set of 4. Please, Lenovo, that would be awesome. Now that's kind of like the lower end Xeon versus lower end AMD EPYC. And we'll show you the performance of these in a little bit. But we also went and said, okay, what happens if we went up the stack? And what happens if we put the AMD EPYC 4464P, which is a 12-core, 24-thread processor in here, which is the top end one you can get. There are 16-core AMD EPYC 4004 series processors available, but they're not available in this system. Now, of course, I hope one day that AMD and Lenovo can find a way to get a 16-core processor in here. We'll see if that happens. But for right now, you're stuck with only 12 cores. But on the other hand, you're stuck with 12 cores, but on the Intel Xeon version, you're stuck with only 8 cores and 16 threads. So you get 50% more cores in the AMD version, even though in some ways it's kind of, you only get like 2 DIMM slots instead of 4. So it just kind of feels like this should end up being like the more expandable system because you can have more cores and you get more performance on the AMD side. Now, in terms of expandability, we've already talked about the 2 M.2 slots, the wireless LAN card slot, but then you get another 2 PCIe slots. Now, on the Intel side, you'll see that we get 3 PCIe slots, but we don't have those built-in M.2 slots. So if you are going to go use M.2 storage because well, of course you'd want to these days, then that would be one of those things that, you would lose a PCIe slot or 2 to do that. And that's why I just feel like I like how they're built in on the ST45 V3. I just kind of think that this is a better design. Okay, now the first thing I want to talk about is how I would customize this if I wanted a little bit more than just kind of the absolute base configuration like we have here. The first thing I might want to do is add that out-of-band management. And so for that, we have this little JetKVM, and these things have been extremely popular with folks. You essentially have a little HDMI cable and you have a little USB cable. You can plug these in with a little network port for our management. And this thing gives us the ability to have our remote keyboard, video, mouse, and it also gives us the ability to go and do remotely mount ISO images and stuff like that. So if you want something like the ST50 V3, it turns out that it might actually, depending on how much it costs you to get your XClarity and all the features that you want, it can actually be cheaper just to go and use these little external devices. And the fact this has HDMI output means even the default kit plugs right in. Okay, now the next one I want to talk about is networking. Now we only get a 1 gig Realtek NIC, and that's really not that fast. So what I would do instead is I would come over here and I would say, hey, Well, we have two different slots. Now, the first slot that I'm very excited about is this little tiny PCIe by 1 slot over there. And so my first thought on this is like, how to get more networking? And one thing you can do is we tested these little dual 2.5 gig Ethernet adapters, and these are perfect for a system like this. Okay, so now with this card installed, you're gonna see that on the back, we have gone from having 1 Ethernet port to having 3 Ethernet ports. Now we have our 1 gig port plus we have our 2.5 gig ports. Now we've been waiting for a use case for this card for so long. This is the Sonnet McFiver. So what this card has is it has a 10 gigabit Ethernet network port, but that's not it, because there are also 2 USB Type-C 10 gigabit ports, and there are 2 M.2 slots. So this has a ton of functionality all in a single card, and it's pretty easy to go install in a server like this. So we look at our block diagram, you're gonna see that slot 1 where we just installed the McFiver, that one is directly connected to our CPU, but then all the rest of the IO happens off of our PCH. So think about what this little server can do now. We have a total of 4 M.2 SSDs that we can install. We can get Wi-Fi. We have 3 video outputs, an audio out, and we have a number of USB ports. And then when it comes to networking, we have an absolute ton of ports because we have our base 1 gig port, we have our 2.5 gig ports, and we have a single 10 gig port. So that gives us a total of 16 gigabits per second of networking. And the only slot that we're really using for a dedicated NIC is that by 1 slot, right? So this is actually an awesome solution. Now, in terms of further customization, this system, just because we had to film with one of these two, right? This still has the 4-core AMD EPYC 4124P processor, but moving up to that 4464P gets us 12 cores. So we triple our core count. We can also move from our base configuration, which in Lenovo world is usually 8 or 16 gigabytes these days, and you can go all the way up to 64 gigabytes in supported configurations. And if you really wanted to, there are 48 gig DIMM options that we'll talk about, especially on the STH main site review. That gives you 96 gigabytes of memory if you get it working in the system. So at this point, let's get to the performance and power consumption so we can talk a little bit about how the ST45 V3 actually kind of in a weird way performs better than the ST50 V3, even though it's a numerically higher model number. Now, of course, you're probably sitting there wondering how much power do these systems use and like how loud are they? The first answer I think is, let's just get to the noise one because that's the easy one. Frankly, these things run at well under our 34 dBA noise floor studio in terms of noise at like 1 meter. You would see that, you know, like frankly, you can kind of hear the fan if you get your ear right up to it, especially if it's at idle. I think the maximum that we got these was to right around 40 dBA, which is pretty quiet in a 34 dBA noise floor studio. For the Intel Xeon E, we had a 4-core 4-thread processor. Now, a lot of people will just look at the TDP of those processors and say like, oh, of course, you know, that's going to use way less power at 55 watts than our AMD EPYC one, which is using 65 watt TDP. And that's completely wrong in some ways. So on the idle side, the AMD EPYC was in that maybe 13 to 15 watt range at idle. And then when we look over at the Intel Xeon E side, we were getting that like 22 to 26 watt range. So we definitely saw more power consumption at idle. Now there are a few things that definitely are influencing that. And I think the number one is the fact that we have the xClarity controller running on the ST50 V3. And just in general on server BMCs, we tend to see them run in that 5 to 7 watt range. And so it's just kind of common. Still, even with that, the AMD EPYC is actually using less power even at idle, even if you were to take away that BMC. So to me, that's actually a really good result. Now, when we switch over and we do the load, of course, the Intel Xeon, we were getting about 70 to 72 watts. And then when we swapped over to the AMD EPYC, we were in that 89 to 92 watt range. But of course, we have to go put that power consumption in the context of performance, because if we're using this thing at 100%, the AMD EPYC was significantly faster. Okay, so let's start out with our base case, which is really that AMD EPYC 4124P and the Intel Xeon E 2414. Now these of course are not the high-end processors, but what they do tell us is if you get the, kind of low-end, lower cost configs, what does that look like? And we saw a pretty consistent increase in performance using the ST45 V3 and that AMD EPYC 4004 series processor because it had SMT. That SMT means that we get 4 cores and 8 threads, where on the Intel side, for some reason they turn off hyper-threading, so we only have 4 cores, 4 threads. Now those extra SMT threads we talked about a couple weeks ago in our SMT piece that we did, and so you can definitely look up some of the performance impacts and what have you of the SMT on versus off and why it's actually pretty good for performance. But here, these are just really good examples all the way down into Geekbench showing why the SMT on and the EPYC 4004 was a little bit faster. But of course, that's really the lower end. What happens when we go to the higher end? What happens when we start having something like a 12-core processor on the AMD side, which also can happen with the 4464P at only 65 watts, just like the 4-core processor we just showed. And when we go to the Intel side, if you max out the ST50 V3, you're still at the Intel Xeon E2488, which is only an 8-core 16-thread processor. And frankly, those two, just the fact that AMD has 50% more cores and 50% more threads, they actually do way better in terms of performance. With that, let's get to our key lessons learned and what happens when you start customizing this server. Okay, so for our key lessons learned, I mentioned that we're gonna go and make this awesome, and that's exactly what we're gonna do. So first thing we're gonna do is that Lenovo says that you can configure this up to 64 gigabytes of memory in two 32 gig DDR5 ECC DIMMs. We of course decided, since we had them, to use the 48 gigabyte modules, giving us a total of 96 gigabytes in the server. So we got it with 16. Lenovo says you can go up to 64, but unofficially 96 worked. We already showed that we went all the way up to that 12-core AMD EPYC 4464P, which I think is a great one if you need more performance. If you don't really need extra performance, then there's no reason to go get a higher end processor like that. But if you do need extra performance and you just want more cores in your system, 12 cores in an entry-level server is absolutely phenomenal. Now, let's talk a little bit about what we did on the networking side, adding that 1 gig NIC, also adding the two 2.5 gig ports plus the 10 gigabit port. That gave us a ton of networking options. Now, of course, would I have liked to have had more networking on board? Sure. Would I have liked to have 2.5 gig on board? Yeah, of course I would. But on the other hand, I do think that this was okay, at least in terms of giving you a set of options, right? Of course, if you didn't want to use something like that McFiver card and you wanted a faster NIC, you could do that. But this is again an entry-level server, so I think this was probably a little bit of networking overkill, but super cool. The other thing we did, of course, was we added 4 NVMe SSDs. Sometimes, frankly, you just need a little bit extra capacity. I'm sure, of course, people are going to go put things like the 122 terabyte drives that we can't show yet, or the 61.44 terabyte drives, or something like that in there, and you could do that. But I don't know why you would put such an expensive drive in a system like this, right? It doesn't really make any sense. The other thing that you can do is you can put a Wi-Fi card in here. Now, the one challenge that we had was that we didn't have the little pieces that you can actually go and nicely put in that extra M.2 SSD and that Wi-Fi card. I wish that Lenovo included those because that would just be like way better in this server. But you can, of course, add those two in there. But in terms of traditional key lessons learned, I have 3 big ones, right? The number one, Lenovo, please, can we get 16 core processors in this? That would just be way cooler, be way better, and it would also be more efficient to use our Windows Server license packs. I know a lot of these servers in the entry segment get used for Windows Server, so I think it would just be better if you had an option for that. And frankly, you have enough room in this chassis that should be an option. And while we're at it, why can't we also get 4 DIMM slots, just like we get on the Intel version? The EPYC 4004 series, of course, supports 4 DIMM slots, which is 2 DIMMs per channel. I just think that the AMD version should get that as well. Now, the next one, of course, is I wish that this had the xClarity controller. I know that you can use things like JetKVMs and all those, and in a lot of small, medium businesses, frankly, people don't want or don't need the iKVM features if it's going to be like a system that's hooked up to a TV or a monitor or something like that to manage. So I get that. But on the other hand, it would just be nice at least to have it as an option. The kind of strange thing about the ST45 V3 and the ST50 V3 is that, our data shows that the ST45 V3 is the faster system. To me, it just feels like Lenovo could make some of those features more on par with the ST50 V3. And then that way you could just pick AMD versus Intel. I think folks have heard this, but the HPE micro server, we are gonna be doing a review of that one, but that is one that like every time I look at that, all I can think is like, why did they not just go back to AMD and use an AMD EPYC in it? It would be so much better if they did. So at least Lenovo kind of got the message and they realized, hey, the EPYC 4004 series kind of beats the pants off of Intel's Xeon E at this point. We should be using that, and they finally made an entry-level server with that. So I just hope that all the other vendors do the same. But of course, I'd love to hear what you guys think, so definitely put those down in the comments. And if you did like this video, well, share it with your friends and colleagues, but also give it a like, click subscribe, and turn on those notifications so you can see whenever we come out with great new videos. As always, thanks for watching and have an awesome day.